American Civil War was a conflict in the United States between the Union in the North and the Confederacy in the South, the latter of which was formed in 1861 by states that seceded from the Union. The primary issue leading to the war was whether slavery should be allowed to expand into the Western territories, thereby increasing the number of slave states, or be prohibited from expanding, which many believed would set slavery on a path to eventual extinction. Decades of controversy over slavery culminated when Abraham Lincoln, the eventual 16th President of the United States, who opposed the expansion of slavery, won the 1860 presidential election. In response to Lincoln's victory, seven southern slave states, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, seceded from the United States and formed the Confederate States of America on February 8, 1861. The Confederacy seized US forts and other federal assets within their borders. The Civil War began on April 12, 1861, where Confederate forces bombarded Fort Sumter in South Carolina. While the Civil War raged on, in the background were the former US presidents who had once governed the now fragmented United States. Few ex-presidents lived to see the Civil War, as the period from the 1840s to the early 1860s saw the passing of many prominent American politicians. By the war's onset in 1861, only 5 former presidents were still alive: Martin Van Buren, John Tyler, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan. So what were their thoughts on what was happening to the nation, and who did they support? Martin Van Buren, the 8th President of the United States and the most senior of the 5, was likely the most staunch Unionist among the former presidents. Known as a war Democrat, he openly supported the Union. In the years leading up to the Civil War, Van Buren vigorously opposed Southern secession, although ultimately without success. He reacted most strongly to the Confederate bombardment of Fort Sumter in 1861, stating, "The attack upon our flag and the capture of Fort Sumter by the secessionists could be regarded in no other light than as the commencement of a treasonable attempt to overthrow the federal government by military force." Despite being strongly against slavery, Martin Van Buren was one of the few Democrats who did not switch to the Republican Party in the 1850s, even as the Democratic Party began to support the institution of slavery. Initially, he supported US Senator from Illinois, Stephen A. Douglas, the 1860 Democratic candidate, but the onset of the war eventually led him back to Abraham Lincoln. When fellow former President Franklin Pierce proposed using their presidential influence to negotiate an end to the war, Van Buren refused, believing Pierce's peace terms would allow the Confederacy to continue to exist. Van Buren died in 1862 from asthma as the conflict intensified. John Tyler, the 10th President of the United States, took a staunchly pro-Confederate stance. Unlike other former presidents, he initially sought to remain quiet on the issues leading up to secession, although he ultimately became a reluctant supporter of it. While the Confederate Constitution was being drafted, Tyler continued to advocate for a compromise with the North to avoid conflict. During South Carolina's vote for secession, which he supported, he wrote, "In the midst of all this, I remain quiescent, no longer an actor on the stage of public affairs. I leave to others the settlement of existing disputes. Sometimes I think it would be better for all to peaceably separate." Initially, John Tyler helped organize the Washington Peace Conference of 1861. However, when the conference failed, he promptly issued a statement supporting the Confederate position and blamed the Union for the situation. After leaving the peace conference in Washington, D.C., the Virginia native traveled to Richmond, where he served as a delegate at the Virginia Secession Convention and voted in favor of secession. Once Virginia seceded, Tyler joined the Confederacy and became a member of the Confederate Congress. He served in the Confederate House of Representatives from his election in 1861 until his death in 1862. Tyler's death was the only one in presidential history not to be officially recognized in Washington due to his allegiance to the Confederate States of America. Although he had requested a simple burial, Confederate President Jefferson Davis orchestrated a grand politically charged funeral, portraying Tyler as a hero to the new nation. Consequently, at his funeral, the coffin was draped with a Confederate flag, making him the only US president ever laid to rest under a flag other than that of the United States. Thus, Tyler's loyalty was ultimately more aligned with his home state Virginia and his own principles than with the Union he once served as president. The 13th and 14th presidents of the United States, Millard Fillmore and Franklin Pierce, privately shared similar views, though publicly there was a significant gap between them. Both Fillmore and Pierce denounced secession and initially supported Lincoln's efforts to retake secessionist states by force. However, they were more openly critical of Lincoln's wartime policies than other former presidents. Both were opposed to the Emancipation Proclamation and criticized Lincoln's suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, a tool preventing the government from unlawfully imprisoning individuals outside of the judicial process. Franklin Pierce became a vocal Copperhead, opposing the Civil War and advocating for an immediate peace settlement with the Confederates. He denounced the actions of Lincoln and the Republican Party, delivering major public addresses to that effect. After the Emancipation Proclamation, Pierce even wrote that a war prosecuted to end slavery is itself treason. In contrast, Millard Fillmore was publicly a Unionist. While he privately criticized some of the actions of the Republicans and Lincoln, he remained firmly in favor of the Union and opposed to the Confederate cause. After the attack on Fort Sumter, Franklin Pierce attempted to organize a presidential peace conference of former presidents, hoping to use their influence to broker a peace deal. He confided to his wife, "I will never justify, sustain, or in any way or to any extent uphold this cruel, heartless, aimless, unnecessary war." Pierce wrote to Martin Van Buren, suggesting that he organized a conference as the most senior former president. Van Buren replied, essentially challenging Pierce to take initiative himself if he believed in it so strongly. Ultimately, Pierce never followed through with the idea. Privately, Pierce offered some help to Jefferson Davis, his Secretary of War during his presidency, and the first and only president of the Confederate States from 1861 to 1865. James Buchanan, the 15th President of the United United States, served from 1857 to 1861 and left office just 2 months before the Civil War commenced. Buchanan was opposed to the conflict and expressed his views in his final national addresses, particularly in his 4th annual message to Congress. He considered secession to be illegal and opposed to Confederacy, but believed that the authority to declare military action was a power reserved for Congress. James Buchanan appointed John Tyler as a special envoy to Congress, a move that ultimately led to the unsuccessful Washington Peace Conference of 1861. Throughout the secession crisis, Buchanan advocated for peace negotiations and lobbied Congress members to support various diplomatic efforts. He hoped for a peaceful resolution up until the end of his presidency. After leaving office, Buchanan largely refrained from public commentary on the war and the war effort, though he privately supported the Republican commitment to the conflict. Like Van Buren, Buchanan can be characterized as a war Democrat, albeit more reserved in expressing his views. He publicly condemned the secessionist actions at Fort Sumter as treasonous and a deliberate provocation for war. Following the first Battle of Bull Run on July 21, 1861, James Buchanan privately wrote to former Assistant Postmaster General Horatio King. The assault upon Fort Sumter was a commencement of war by the Confederate States, and no alternative was left but to prosecute it with vigor on our part. He was also quoted as telling a friend, "Every person who has conversed with me knows that I am in favour of sustaining the government in the vigorous prosecution of the war for the restoration of the Union." In the later years of the war, James Buchanan sought to repair his reputation by writing his memoirs, which were published in 1866. In these memoirs, he defended his actions during his presidency, particularly his handling of the secession crisis. Buchanan, however, was reluctant to support Lincoln's war policies, often to avoid acknowledging his own shortcomings leading up to the war. Today's inability to prevent the Civil War is often characterized as a failure, and historians and scholars frequently rank James Buchanan among the worst presidents in American history. Thus, aside from John Tyler, the former presidents of the era generally agreed that the South's secession was unjustified and that the North was justified in using military force to restore the Union. Even John Tyler, who was initially opposed to the conflict, reluctantly supported the decisions of his home state, Virginia. This hasn't made Jack, and if you're going to start your own country, please leave a comment down below.